In this video, we're going to be explaining your communication theories paper that's coming up. You can check the syllabus for the deadline, but in this paper, the objective is to apply a concept from the reading and analyze a situation, communication situation from your life. I'm calling it a case, but it's not exactly a case study, but that's just a shorthand way to refer to it. So the idea is that you want to take one clear concept from the reading and apply it to some kind of relationship or situation from your personal life. You shouldn't write a paper that's about you observing a situation, like you noticed what your boss is doing with other people or what's happening between your parents or so forth, or your roommates. It should involve you as a central character. You want to draw on concepts that resonate with or speak to your experience. That's oftentimes happens, we notice when, let's say, we're reading something and something pops off the page and we go, oh wow, that makes sense for me. That connects to it. Something like this happened to me just the other day. Well, that's the kind of concept you want to pick. I want you to focus on concepts from chapters 5, 6, and 7, the message, conversation, and the relationship. Some of the other concepts in other chapters are good too, but we'll focus and help you draw your attention to these three for this paper. And you want to draw on things in your life that can be either a great success or something that didn't go so well at all. And that way, at the end of the paper, you're able to create some communication recommendations. So let's unpack some of the details. It's going to be 3 to 4 pages long. Doesn't count the title page reference page. You should have a title page reference page. Clear, understandable sentences, got to be proofread. 12-point font, even the title page. Don't make some weird title page that has all kinds of designs and things. APA style, and review the sample paper or papers online thoroughly before you write yours. Sample papers will help demystify what I'm looking for. All right, so here's the expected structure. You're going to have an introduction paragraph, and I want these 4 parts. First, an introduction or opening where it's 2 to 3 sentences that guide the reader down or the audience down to your thesis. You can read through the details here, but some kind of opening sentence or so, a few sentences there that guide us into the topic of the paper. Then state the purpose of the essay, and that is pretty straightforward. Something like, in this essay, I apply family systems theory to my recent discussion with my mother and father about how to spend the holidays. So you're being very clear there, but that's what but this isn't your thesis. A lot of times people mistake the purpose of the essay with the thesis. The thesis is where you give an argument, one clear sentence that states your case, your claim about what was going on. So here's an example. I argue that my family showed high levels of communication, but low levels of conformity. Now, if you know this theory, that makes sense. But there's a claim about what's happening. And then you give a little preview of the paper. Very concise, keep it short. You're previewing the main 3 parts of the paper. And the 3 parts are as follows. Part 1 is where you define your concept. And when you're defining your concept, it's important to define your concept, but you don't need to explain the whole theory, or especially you don't need to go into what tradition of research it's from. You just want to be laser beam focused on the concept that you'll later apply. When you're explaining in part 1 here the concept, you're not talking about your case. You introduced it in your thesis and your preview, but in part 1 you're just laying out a definition and an explanation in your own words. So here you're going to write a good topic sentence, define the concept clearly, quote and cite passages directly from the text, and then you're going to explain in your own words. Importantly, when you're citing things from the text and you're quoting things, don't just drop a whole sentence in there from the text. You have to set it up. You have to start the sentence with a little bit of your own words to ease into the quote. Don't just copy and paste these quotes, because you want the paragraph to be your own. You want it to read smoothly and not in a choppy way. So we're still in part 1 here, and then you explain this a little bit in your own words, maybe give a brief example, but not an example from the situation or case that you can explain later, just another one from the book or another one that's unrelated to your case. So once you do this in 1 paragraph, you're going to go on to part 2, and this might take you a couple of paragraphs, but this is where you explain your situation, your case, introduce it with a clear topic sentence. The topic sentence should mention the concept and the situation. It's not just a story here. You're telling a story with the vocabulary of that concept that you laid out in part 1, so it's important to keep that in the mix. Explain the case in detail, lots of communication details, vivid details, direct quotes from conversation as accurately as you can remember. I say, hey, 80 or 90% accurate, that's good. Obviously, you don't want to make stuff up because it's not going to sound authentic, but you want to try the best you can to recreate the conversation. This is considered your data. It's qualitative data, like bits of the conversation. Because if you only have vague or general statements like, oh, we were yelling at each other, that's not really going to make for a very good analysis. You're supposed to analyze this stuff. So you want to give good conversational details. So instead of we were yelling at each other, you want to actually detail a little bit of the back and forth conversation. What was said specifically. And then give us that slow motion look at those key moments in the communication, as much as you can remember. And again, as you tell the case, as you tell your story, you're using this vocabulary of that concept that you introduced earlier to pick it apart and analyze it. You're not just telling a story for the sake of the story. You're showing what was going on in the story with that concept. And then toward the end of this section, as your story is starting to wrap up, you have to really nail it down with a concept. A few thoughtful, analytical sentences that tie this example and the case together with the concept in a really direct way. Even though you've already been talking about the situation with the vocabulary of the concept, here you want to tease it out a little bit and cite a source to support your point. So pull a quote from the book, author, page number, use quotation marks that help support what you're saying and help you make your point. So this is part 1 and part 2. Part 3 is where you give the recommendations. So here you have advice. 1 paragraph for each recommendation, and since you're going to be giving 2 or 3 recommendations, that means part 3 has 2 or 3 paragraphs. Each recommendation has a good topic sentence. Actually, the whole section has a topic sentence, like something about recommendations, and then you want to have a separate paragraph, and so you have a separate topic sentence for each paragraph for each piece of advice. So based upon the theory and the case, what are 2 to 3 pieces of advice you would give yourself? And also, what's some advice you'd give the other person? So maybe you have 1 or 2 pieces of advice for yourself, 1 or 2 pieces of advice for the other person in the case. So let's say you're having an argument with a roommate, and you use some concept, for example, argumentativeness. That's a concept from one of the chapters. You use that. Well, then you're going to give a recommendation for yourself, maybe 2 recommendations, similar for your roommate, maybe 1 or 2 recommendations. And then together you come up with 2 to 3 recommendations or pieces of advice about what you either did really well, and so in that way you should continue to do, or what you could do better, what you should do instead. So these should be developed into full paragraphs. Each recommendation gets its own developed paragraph. Each one is clearly labeled first, second, third, and your topic sentence for each one gives direct advice. The bottom line, as they say, comes out in the topic sentence. First, I should have asked clarifying questions to make sure, etc. Then you develop that paragraph and explain what was going on there and what you should have done. Next paragraph. Second, I should have offered some examples to get my boss's reaction too. Let's say this is about a boss. Third paragraph in the recommendation section. Third, my boss should have just told us exactly what he wanted because, and then you go on. So you really want to be super clear, and your advice is just right in that first sentence, and it's all labeled first, second, third. So in each of these paragraphs, what should you have done? Explain exactly what you should have done or what you could do differently next time. You can give some hypothetical examples that show ideal communication. Be sure to include at least 1 recommendation for the other person, maybe 2 if you have a lot of recommendations, but you want to give yourself some good recommendations. Base your advice on the concepts and from the theory and the case. Don't just give advice from your common sense. So you just wrote a whole analysis in part 2 about what was going on, and you used this concept up here in part 1 to explain what's going on in the case. So don't step away from that. Stick right to it. And your advice should draw out of that concept and draw out of the case together. So let's pretend we're talking about argumentativeness and an argument with a roommate. Your recommendation should come out of that concept of argumentativeness. You should say, I shouldn't be as argumentative. Instead, I should look for a commonality. And then you quote something directly from the source, in this case the book, to help support that recommendation. You want to do this for each and every recommendation. Each paragraph for your recommendation section is going to be fully developed, supported with a nice citation and quote from the book, and so everyone has a nice development and it can stand on its own. And then you give a conclusion paragraph. I recommend that you look through these instructions in much more detail, line by line. I also recommend that you look at the sample paper that's available online, and you should not write about the same topic that the sample paper is about, but at least it can give you an idea of what the APA looks like and approximately what each of these sections look like. Like you can look at the sample paper and say, okay, let's see how they did their opening, their purpose, their thesis, their preview. And you don't want to have it you don't want to copy what they did, but it gives you a concrete example of what you did. And I always include papers that were at least pretty good for sample papers. So all those sample papers are B and above. They're not perfect, but they're at least passable at a B level, and so they can give you a basic idea. And the sample paper that you'll be looking at is on compliance gaining, so make sure you do not do your paper on compliance gaining. It'll just sound way too much like the sample paper. Okay, so there you go. There's a whole explanation. Read over these instructions carefully before you start writing.